Much, Christy. As our children head out to Children's Church, y'all can turn with me to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. We're going to be looking today at an important topic, and a topic that I'll be honest isn't always clear. It's one that's not always black and white. There can be some gray area to it, and trying to find that line of what's okay and what's not is not always clear. And so we approach the topic today humbly and praying for the Lord's wisdom. But when I began to prepare for this whole sermon series a few months ago, this passage here in Matthew 5, 13 through 16, about us being the salt of the earth and the light of the world, I planned this to just be one sermon on this particular passage. It appeared to be a very straightforward passage, not too confusing, simple to understand, and honestly one that as I studied the Beatitudes is like, well, this passage very easily and very clearly flows directly out of that passage, which I know last week was our Sanctity of Life Sunday, but the 2 weeks before that, we looked at the Beatitudes, about how Christians can be happy and blessed in this life. We are happy and blessed by aligning ourselves with the Beatitudes, understanding our spiritual poverty and humility and mourning over it. And in light of that poverty, then aligning my will with God's will. That's being meek, aligning my will with God's will instead of being angry that my life isn't aligned or my life isn't going the way that I planned it to go. I'm blessed and happy by seeking satisfaction from Christ and His Word rather than the world. I'm blessed and I'm happy by being merciful to others just as I have received mercy, by seeking purity in my relationship with God and with others. I'm blessed and I'm happy by being a peacemaker and by being diligent and enduring in my relationship with Christ, even in the midst of persecution and trials. That's the way to peace. That's the way to happiness. That's the path to joy. Looking outward of myself and my own desires and my own wants, looking outward to Christ and to others. And as I was planning all of this, it really made sense. The way that we salt and light the world is by living by means of the Beatitudes and pointing the world this way. I honestly believe that's why this passage flows directly out of the Beatitudes. That is the way that we salt and light the world. But as I began to study it, I began to see and to think, there's more here than just merely this. And then as I began to study commentaries, I've got about 4 of them right now on this that I'm looking at that I trust. And the things that I was getting from this, every one of the commentaries hit on the exact same things, and very rarely does that happen. Not that they contradict each other, but maybe some emphasize different things. And all of them emphasized what kind of was jumping out to me. And so, as I began to look at this, it made me realize that I need to dig deep into this passage. I don't just need to scratch the surface of it and just quickly hit it and move on. So today will be a 2-part sermon in which we will look today at what this passage teaches us about the world, and next week then at what the passage teaches us about ourselves, okay? So if you're there with me in Matthew chapter 5, it's a very quick 4 verses. You can follow along as I read verses 13 through 16. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So we're going to look at 2 things today. The first being our relationship with the world, and then next we'll look at more specifically just about the world in general. So first off, our relationship with the world. When we talk about our relationship with the world, I guess first off, I should explain what we mean by the world. Because all of us live in the world. We're on planet Earth, right? At least most of you are. By the end of this, there may be some of you who aren't here. Sometimes I'm talking to my children and it's like, you're here in front of me, but you're not really here, right? We've been there before. So all of you, whether you're here or not, I mean, we're on planet Earth. So what do we mean by being in the world? In general, when the Bible speaks of the world, and what I'm going to mean by that today, the world is referring to lost people, ungodly people, and ungodly things. It's the things of the world that are not of God that we would not deem to be Christian, okay? So, what is our relationship with the things that are not Christian? The people who are not Christians, the things in the world that are not necessarily inherently Christian or maybe even anti-Christian. When we talk about this relationship, to be honest with you, it gets tricky. On one end of the spectrum, you have monks of old who were so committed to holiness that they committed themselves to monasteries to escape sin, thinking that they could be more holy if they lived in seclusion. If they could just seclude themselves from the world and not be around any ungodly people or any ungodly things, that they could be holy. Then on the other end, I'm being serious about this here. Then on the other end, we have churches that are popping up that are now beginning to meet in bars. Now, I think that their motivation is good. They're thinking, look, most of these people who are coming in here getting drunk, they're not being reached by the current churches. So we'll just have church right here in the bar, and maybe some of them, while they're drinking alcohol, will come over here and hear the gospel. Good motivation, but an answer to a problem that I would not necessarily agree with. Though they're out there working, they're trying to reach people, they're trying to engage the world in their own way. So we've got two ends of the spectrum. And probably the middle ground is somewhere in between that. But as I said earlier, where that middle meets isn't exactly clear. And so it's one that we try to come in wisdom, and we try to come humbly. There are two places that I'm going to look today at our relationship in the world. The first is that we are a people in the world. We can't be the monks in the monastery. The monks in the monastery said, I need to seclude myself and leave the world. But this passage here makes clear we cannot do that. We must be a people in the world. For us to salt the earth and light the world, we have to be in the world, right? We can't sprinkle salt on something we're not in, all right? You can't sprinkle salt on food if you don't have food, right? And so we must be a people in the world. The answer to holiness is not trying to keep ourselves away from all of the bad things in life. So salting and lighting demands being in the world and being around the world, okay? Isolating ourselves from the world doesn't lead us to holiness anyways for a number of reasons, one of which being, even if I spent the rest of my life in a cave by myself, I still have a sinful heart with sinful desires, okay? You know, yes, the Bible calls us to pluck out our right eye and cut off our right hand. That said, in response to lust, telling a man, you know, if your eye causes you to sin, cut it out and pluck it away. Look, a blind man can lust just the same as a man with vision. Because the lust flows from our hearts, not our eyes. All right? And so secluding myself doesn't actually deal with my heart. But then secondly, secluding ourselves doesn't make us holy because I am not engaging lost people with the gospel when I do that. There's an expectation among Christians that we engage people with the gospel. I can't be holy if I am not giving another person a reason to glorify God. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 8. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 8. Peter writes, he had just talked about people who were destined for hell and who were living contrary to the word. And he says, but you are a holy race, or a holy nation, a royal priesthood, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. Again, you are a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the glories of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. And so I'll get to it later about light, but darkness is another metaphor for sin. God has called you out of sin and into holiness, and therefore wants you going back into that darkness and proclaiming the light so that other people can come out of it. That is an expectation for all Christians. That is why we're doing the Hoosier One emphasis, because there are thousands of people in Webster County who are living in darkness and need the light. And for us to be holy, I've got to engage them so that I can shine the light of the gospel upon them and God can draw them out. I've got to be in the world. I've got to have lost people in my life. I've got to have relationships with lost people. And when I'm around lost people, I then must be intentional about engaging them and talking with them. I'm going to use Nash as an example here. Wade and Lacey and them went on a cruise last week with some other people. And when they were on the bus, I think on the way back from the cruise, Nash was talking to the bus driver about the cruise. And the bus driver told him that he's probably never seen anything as big as that boat before. Here was Nash's response, just this quick. He said, I've seen something. No, he said, I know something bigger than that boat. And he said, what? He said, God. God's bigger than that boat. Right? You know, and we look at that and we laugh and we smile, but here's a 4 or 5-year-old boy who did exactly what we adults are supposed to do, but we don't. He took a general earthly conversation and that quickly turned it into spiritual things. See, because 4 and 5-year-olds aren't concerned about what people think of them. We are. And he just as easily shifted it to spiritual things. He engaged a lost person with something spiritual and got that conversation going. And we in the world are called to do the same thing. So we are in the world, but we are not of the world. We are in the world, but we are not of the world. What do I mean by that? Okay, we are in the world, but the world must never define us. The world must never define us, nor should our lives ever look like the world. We are in the world, but we are distinct. I'll get to this more next week, okay? The essence of light is that it's the opposite of darkness. Paul says in Philippians 2 that we as Christians, we are to shine like stars in the night sky. All right? That star separates itself. It is clearly distinct from that which it is around. Yes, we are in the world just as the stars are in the darkness of the sky, but it is distinct. You never get the sky confused with stars. So too, we are never confused with the world. Some people like to argue to this and point out how Jesus spent time with sinners and prostitutes and drunkards and the like. My answer to that is yes, Jesus befriended prostitutes and drunkards and tax collectors and all other kinds of sinners, but he never actually participated in sin with them. And I'd go even further than this, nor was Jesus ever around them while they were actually participating in the sin. We never saw Jesus walking the streets with a prostitute. We never see Jesus of course, we never see Jesus getting drunk, but we never see Jesus actually with somebody while they're getting drunk. We don't see Jesus sitting beside tax collectors while they're robbing people at their tax collector's booth. We see him engaging sinners outside of their sin. And I believe that's an important distinction to make. Yes, Jesus engaged sinners so frequently that all the supposed godly people wanted to kill him. They thought that he was wrong for how much he engaged sinners, yet he never engaged sinners on their own turf, so to speak. Yes, he even went to their houses, but not in the midst of their sins. Romans 16:19 says this: I want you to be wise as to what is good. And listen to this, and innocent to what is evil. I want you to be wise to what is good and innocent to what is evil. Yes, we are engaging the world. We are around the world. We are building relationships with lost people. But I am protecting my heart from the evils of this life. So there's a balance to be found here. We befriend, we build relationships with sinners, but all the while staying wise to what is good and innocent to what is evil. That means staying away from the evil. We don't want to let the sin of our friends creep over into our lives. You know, it's interesting when we look to the nation of Israel, why God told them that you cannot marry anyone but an Israelite. It's not because God is a racist, but because because Israel was the only nation in all the earth that worshiped God. And this is what he told them. He told the men, if you take foreign wives who worship other gods, they will lead you astray to worship them as well. And throughout Israel's history, we see Israel doing the exact opposite of what God said. Bringing foreign wives into Israel, worshiping them, and then following and not worshiping them, but marrying them, and then following and worshiping their gods. Solomon did it. That was Solomon's downfall. Outside of the fact he married 750 women, that was problem number one. But then outside of that, the 750 women that weren't of the nation of Israel. And what did he do? He began to worship all of their gods and built shrines to them as well. All right? And so when we surround ourselves with people who are ungodly, can we influence them sometimes for good? Yes. But most likely what's going to happen is they're going to influence us. This is why the Bible calls us to not be unequally yoked. Okay? 2 Corinthians 6:14. 2 Corinthians 6:14. Paul writes, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. Listen to this. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? Now, most of the time, this is applied to marriage, all right? Don't marry somebody who's an unbeliever. But it goes beyond that to the people that we are yoked with in life. For one thing, especially for some of you younger ones, you children and youth in here, what does that mean to be yoked, okay? It has in mind, before we had these big combines with air conditioners and speakers and remote controls and everything, and all these other luxuries you farmers live in. Before we had all of that, and I hope y'all understand I'm joking. I appreciate what y'all do, and I understand y'all work hard. But it doesn't change the fact you have an air conditioner in your combine that you can use, that you can drive with a remote control. So this is before those days, right? And you had to plow by hand, and you had two oxen in front of you pulling it, and to make sure they were pulling evenly, you put a yoke that went over the two of their necks and connected them together so that they were pulling at the same time. And so what Paul is talking about, in our lives, we have a tendency of being yoked with other people. Most of the time, it's with our spouses, but we have friends we can be yoked with. There are other people that, you know, when you think of one person, you think of the other as well because they're always together, right? He says, don't be unequally yoked. If you are yoked together, inevitably the two of you will start acting like each other. And yes, we need to have lost friends, but our closest friends must never be the lost. Jesus, again, probably had more lost friends than anyone, to the point they wanted to kill him over it. But who are his 12 closest friends? Who are his 3 closest friends? Why is this so important to us? 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, bad company corrupts good morals. Bad company corrupts good morals. High schoolers, college students, elementary students, who are you yoked with? Who are the main influencers in your life? Who dictates the way you act and think more so than anyone else? One of the biggest blessings of my life when I was in middle school and high school was having a godly group of friends who went to my same church, who were from Christian families, who wanted the same things in my life. And there were times when I would be tempted to fall into sin. And one of the things that held me back was knowing that I would have to face those friends, knowing that they would be willing to call me to the carpet on my life. And then as I got into college, my freshman year wasn't the greatest year. Why? Because primarily I was out of church. And then my sophomore year, I get back in church. I kind of get a new group of friends, which some of my high school friends were a part of that as well. Ones that I'm still friends with today. One of them's a missionary in Africa. He called me 2 weeks ago. He came back to America and called me, and we talked for a long time on the phone. But godly groups of friends that I was in college that I grew not only close to them with, but to the Lord with. And I can't fathom being where I am today without the influence, without being yoked with other godly people. And so, are you in the world is the first question. Well, Pastor, again, what kind of question is that? I'm right here, aren't I? Yes, you are. But Christ is calling you more than just to be here, but to influence the world. So, do we have lost people in our lives? Look, to be honest, for me and Hillary, that's difficult. My job is you. It's to be around you, which is one of the benefits I have or things I like about coaching. Not only do I enjoy it, just sports in general and coaching my children, but it gives me opportunities to build relationships with lost people that I would not have otherwise. And so how are we intentionally engaging the world? Okay? And then secondly, the question, are you of the world? Is there a difference between you and the world? Are those who influence your life like those who are letting their light shine, or their darkness cast a cloud in your life? So secondly, now we've looked at their relationship to the world. What does this passage teach us about the world? What does this passage teach us about the world? And it is this: the world is a rotten and dark place. The world is a rotten and dark place. Ephesians chapter 5. If you can turn there with me. Ephesians chapter 5. I'll begin in verse 3. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 3. But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints. Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving. For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure or who is covetous, that is, an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Listen to verse 7. Therefore, do not become partakers with them. All right, so why should I not become partakers with them? One, because God's wrath is coming upon the world. But even more than that, verse 8, listen. For at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true. And try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret. Do not become partakers with them. Why? For at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. All right? Looking at this, specifically salt and then specifically light. What is the purpose of salt? All right? There are two main purposes of salt. One is to preserve food, and the other is to flavor food. One is to preserve, one is to flavor. So what does it teach us about the earth? That we are supposed to salt the earth. That we are the salt that God has sprinkled upon it. What is it? That the earth has a rottenness to it. It has a tendency to pollution and becoming foul and offensive. The world is fallen, sinful, and bad. Its tendency is to evil and wars. Just watch the news. I don't care what channel. Watch the news. It is like meat, which has a tendency to putrefy and to become polluted. It is something that can only be kept wholesome by means of a preservative or antiseptic. The world left to itself without any influence of Christ tends to fester and spoil. Therefore, in light of that, Paul says, do not become partakers with them. Don't become like the world. Don't become partakers of the world. All right? It's like that gallon of milk your wife won't throw away because it's going to stink and it's gross, and you go and get that gallon of milk to drink it, and she's like, no, don't do it. Don't partake of that unless you've made her mad, and she just sits there and looks, and then you drink of it out of the jug, and about the time you smell it and you taste it, it's too late. You've done it, it's old, it stinks, and it's chunky. And you realize, bad decision, shouldn't have partaken of that. All right, shouldn't have made my wife mad, and she would have warned me. Right? And so Paul's saying, don't partake of it. It's festered, it's spoiled, it's gross. It's the meat that you've left out too long before it's refrigerated. But then you eat it unaware of the germs and diseases that are now on it, that you ingest and you fill your body with. And you wake up in the middle of the night with your head in the toilet for 12 hours. These things are the pleasures and the promises of the world that look good on the surface, but are spoiled and rotten inside. Turn with me to 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2, verses 15, 16, and 17. 1 John chapter 2, verses 15, 16, and 17. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride in possessions, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. So he says there's three things in the world. The desires of the eyes. It begins with the desires of the flesh. What is that? That's our desires and our lust for sinful and wrong things. The desires of the flesh is our desire for sinful and wrong things. The desire of the eyes, the things I see that make me want them. It's the possessions that other people have, the trips that people go on and post on Facebook that before I didn't want, but as soon as I see it, I want. And I want to spend my money to go on a trip like them so that I can have the joys that they want, even though I don't have the money to do it. It's the new clothes that someone's wearing that before I was content with my clothes, but now I see them wearing it, and now I'm upset with my clothes, and I need to spend money to get their clothes. Things in life that might not necessarily be wrong, but are things we start to seek satisfaction in. Look, we've been there with our children before. They have not wanted toys. They have not wanted clothes. Then you go to Walmart, you go to Target, and what happens? You leave with a screaming child because they think they can't live without what they just saw. Not only did they not want it, they didn't even know that thing existed. Now they will literally die instantly without it. Right? That's the pride of the eyes. We see things and suddenly our flesh and everything inside of it says, I got to have it. The pride of life, reputation. What will people think of me? What are people thinking of me right now? I walked into the room, people are looking at me. They must be talking about me. What are they thinking about me? We're angry at our kids not because they disobeyed, but what are people going to think of how I parent? You embarrassed me. We've been there. I've been there. Our desire is not for godliness, but it's for reputation. And John says here that the world fits into these categories, and this is what he says about it. The world, along with its desires, are passing away. Those desires for immoral things, those desires to fill our life with stuff, that desire for notoriety, it's rotten, it stinks, it's festering, and it's passing away. It holds absolutely zero ability to truly satisfy you. That's what the world looks like. Secondly, looking at light. What's the purpose of light? Light exposes, and it guides. Anyone who's walked through the house in the middle of the night and stubbed your toe wished you had light. It would have exposed the corner of whatever you hit your toe on and would have guided you past it. The Bible speaks a lot about light and darkness. I've already mentioned passages from 1 Peter 2, 2 Corinthians 6, and Ephesians 5. But in Colossians chapter 1, verse 13, we find another one. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of His beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of our sins. The Lord has given us light and then called us to let that light shine because the world is darkened in their understanding of life. Okay? The fact that we are called to be light means everyone else is living in darkness. They do not, they have not been exposed. They're not being guided. They're darkened in their understanding of life. What do I mean by that? The problems, the causes of those problems, and what the answers to those problems are. They're not able to tell us what is responsible for the present state of the world. Lost people can look at the world and say, man, this place is messed up. This is wrong. It shouldn't be like this. But they are incapable. They are ignorant. They're darkened in their understanding of why the world is wrong and how the world gets out of it. Ephesians chapter 4. I realize I'm all over the place today. That's okay. If you're tired of turning, then just turn your ears on and listen. Ephesians 4, 17 through 19. Now this I say and testify on the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do in the futility of their minds. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God. Why? Because of the ignorance that is in them due to their hardness of heart. They have become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. They can't, because of their hardness of heart, they are ignorant to the things of God. Therefore, they're darkened and unable to understand. Just think today about the media and the world's reaction to mass murderers. Gun argument aside, what's their reaction? They must be sick. That's their reaction. They must be sick. Here's another place they go with it. This country has failed again in the mental health crisis. We have got to get better at helping people with mental health to stop this stuff from happening. I'm not denying they had mental issues, but what was the cause of those? They don't know. I do know. Romans chapter 3. Romans chapter 3. The Lord does not leave us in the dark about this, but sheds light on it. Romans chapter 3, verse 10. As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps or of snakes is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Listen to verse 15. Their feet are swift to shed blood. And their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. You see, the world can't understand what would drive somebody to come in and shoot up a place. And they deny that there is a holy God who's going to hold us accountable. And they deny that there is right and wrong in the world. There is no fear of God. And so their only explanation is they're sick. Which, what does that do? That makes an excuse. They can't be held accountable because they're sick and the country has failed them. The world doesn't view our lives as God does today. In fact, most scientists today completely reject the entire notion of God. So they're making decisions out of their atheistic worldview, calling it science, putting it in their books, and then feeding it to our children in the schools as fact. The world is constantly trying to figure out why I feel the way that I feel. trying to figure out why I think the way that I think and act the way that I act. And then they go and see counselors and see people who have been trained in what? An atheistic worldview of why we feel the way that we feel and think the way that we think and act the way that we act. All the while, God's Word addresses emotions, addresses thoughts, addresses actions. The world is darkened in their understanding of why you feel the way that you feel. Maybe they can describe it and say a person who feels like this has these symptoms. They can accurately do that, but they can't say why they feel the way that they feel or the path out of it. They're darkened in their understanding. And so, if they can't understand why we do what we do, then they certainly cannot prescribe the answer to change. Likewise, they can't provide the answer to where our satisfaction and joy come from in life. Church, the world will always be giving answers. That's what advertisements are for, right? Trying to get you to believe it and to follow them. That's why men are so bad at grocery shopping, because we see bright, shiny things on boxes and we're like, ooh, that looks good, let me get that. You know, women can make better decisions about grocery shopping. Men are easily led astray by these different things. And children watching commercials, again, they see commercials and they make all these lists. The advertisements are given to us to draw us to them. The world is constantly giving advertisements. This vacation, this car, these clothes, this boyfriend, a husband, a perfect health, no problems, Las Vegas, more money. The world is constantly throwing all of these things at us. But none of them are the real answer to our problems. Found this quote. I don't even know who said it. Found this quote. The ordinary Christian, though he may have never read any philosophy at all, knows and understands more about life than the greatest expert who is not a Christian. Another way of saying it is the most simple-minded Christian knows more about life than the most knowledgeable lost person. Going back to salt, another function of salt is to provide flavor so that the food is not bland. We've all been there, excited about the mashed potatoes, scoop them up, no taste to them. What do? You got to reach for the salt. Salt them up, all right? Some of you, as you get older, you have to wait till your wife looks away and then salt them up, right? And so we want to bring flavor to our food. Living without Christ, or even living contrary to how Christ calls you, is like eating bland food with no taste. So you keep trying new seasoning, one after the other, trying to find something. Will this bring me joy? Will that bring me joy? Will this bring me joy? The other night, Hillary made spaghetti, which was good spaghetti. It wasn't bland. Believe me, I just like certain seasoning on my spaghetti that other people might not like. So I put it on mine. Samuel wanted to try it on his. But he, being hard-headed, he wanted to pour it on himself. I'm sure y'all know where this is going. I warned him. It comes out fast. He said he could do it. Half the bottle went on the spaghetti. It wasn't really half the bottle, but he poured way too much. So then he tries to mix it up and eats it, and what happens? It was disgusting. It was gross. So we then had to get him more. We had to get him another plate of spaghetti. So often we try to do that in our life. We're trying to season our life with things of the world, trying to season it one after the other. Try this, try this, try this, try this, try this. And then suddenly our life is like Samuel's spaghetti. Ugh. It's not worth anything anymore. It's good for nothing. Lost people are looking to a putrefied world for excitement and joy. A world that will not satisfy them and fulfill them. But with Christ, He is our portion and our strength. With Christ, He is the river of living eternal water. With Christ, even if we were to never receive another blessing in all of life, so we would still be satisfied. Christianity is not bland, but is rather the flavor of life. For many here today, though, they might say, well, I'm a Christian and I don't have joy. I don't have peace. I don't have satisfaction. I'm struggling. Or they might say, I'm a Christian and I'm miserable and I don't know why. If you have your bulletins, I want you to pull out your inserts. On the back of it is a diagram. I draw this diagram with just about every counselor I meet with. In fact, I gave this to y'all back in 2014, which I'm sure all of you remember. from 2014. But when I gave this diagram before, it makes more sense when I'm actually in my office drawing it than having to print it on the back of here. But I want us to take a look at this very quickly. Turn with me to Philippians 4. All right? I use this diagram in this teaching more than any other. All right, Philippians chapter 4, beginning in verse 11. Paul says, "Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound in any and every circumstance. I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need." 2 different times in that passage, Paul says, I've learned the secret of being content and at peace in any and every circumstance. So 2 things there. 1, it's possible to be at peace and content regardless of what you're facing. Secondly, God doesn't have magic fairy dust to sprinkle on you. You got to learn it. If the Apostle Paul had to go through a process of learning it, then so are you and so am I. Okay? It's a process of learning. He says it's a secret, though. What is this secret? He doesn't keep it for long because he gives us the answer in verse 13. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. That doesn't literally mean everything, okay? Yes, I grew up good at basketball and baseball, but I also grew up really slow. No matter how much I love Jesus, I'm never going to win a track and field race, okay? I'm never going to be fast because God didn't make me fast. He made me slow, all right? And so what this is saying is the things that God has called you to do and created you to do through Christ, all of those things are possible. Direct context, peace and contentment. All right, that's general answer. Christ is kind of the umbrella over all of that. More specifically, go back to verse 6. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So, how do I receive that peace? It's not merely through having Christ in my life, but it's instead of me worrying, I go to God in prayer, in thanksgiving and trust. All right? Many people may say, well, Pastor, I'm doing that. I'm trying to not worry. I'm praying, but I'm still worrying. I'll then say, have you done verses 8 and 9? The answer is no, because nobody's heard of verses 8 and 9. Everybody's only heard of 6 and 7. So we then go to verses 8 and 9. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Regularly, husbands and wives may come to me with marital problems, and we'll work through this, and the wife knows she's angry, she's bitter, she needs to get over it, and she's praying about it, and the Lord just won't remove her bitterness from her. But let me ask you this, and I'm sure you know the answer. What is she sitting around thinking about all day? Is it how wonderful her husband is? Is she sitting around thinking about the honorable things about her husband, the lovely things, the commendable things, the excellent things, the praiseworthy things? Or is she thinking about that snide comment he made last night? See, pray all you want, but if your heart and your mind are set on things of the world, the prayer's only going to get so far, okay? So this is where this diagram comes in. Again, it'd be a lot easier if I was drawing this for y'all. But that first heart right there, that heart is what our lives are supposed to look like. Our hearts are supposed to look like the fruits of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. That's what our hearts are supposed to look like, but too often our hearts don't. Notice at the very bottom of that heart, though, there is room for other things. There's room for concern in that heart. As a parent has concern for their child, Paul himself says he faces the daily pressure of concern for all of the churches. There's room for concern. There's even room for things like grief in your heart. Jesus was a man of sorrow, acquainted with grief. There's room for anger in your heart. Godly, righteous anger. But here's the thing, even if those things are in our hearts are still characterized by the fruits of the Spirit. Okay? The love, the joy, the peace, the patience, the kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The problem is what happens in that middle heart right there. That concern that was supposed to keep its proper place, I have lost my self-control, and so that concern boils over into full-blown worry or anxiety. And as that worry and that anxiety boils up out of that concern, suddenly the fruits of the Spirit are thrown out of my heart, and my life is now characterized by worry and anxiety. Or maybe the grief. Look, Paul said, when you grieve, grieving is okay. Jesus wept. When you grieve, grieve not as those who have no hope. There's a place for grief, but what happens? That grief doesn't stay in its proper place, and it boils over into despair. And now our life is characterized by that. Anger. It boils over. Now I'm characterized by bitterness and hatred. Well, what do I do to get it back? How do I find that joy in life? It's the third heart. Really, I've updated this since I first made this diagram back in 2014. We've got the heart. To get that concern and the grief and the anger back down to where it should go, we got to get the fruits back in. How do we get the fruits back in? What should be added to it is over that heart should be prayer and thanksgiving. Prayer and thanksgiving is covering everything that I'm doing. All right, that's what I added to it. Prayer and thanksgiving should be covering all of it. But then more specifically, I'm thinking biblically, I'm acting biblically. As I'm thinking biblically, as I'm acting biblically, I'm pushing those fruits back into my heart, which then drives that despair, that anxiety, that bitterness, that hatred back down to where it should be. For too many people, instead of running to biblical thoughts and biblical actions, we run to the world and the answers that the world has for us. For some, they just want to numb the emotions that they're feeling. For others, they buy into what the answers the world has for why they have their fear, why they have their despair, why they have their anger. And so since they've bought into the diagnosis, they then buy into the answers. And for many, when they find their answer in something other than this world, it sets them apart. Right? When we find our joy and our happiness in the things of God as opposed to the things of the world, we're different. We stand out from everybody else. Right? When we have the heart of Habakkuk, who said, even if I lose everything in life, Christ will still be my strength and my portion. When people hear that you have the heart of Job, who can still fall down and worship God even when in one day he lost all possessions, his wife and all 10 children, when you can bow down and worship and say, the Lord gave everything to me, therefore he has the right to take it away, that sets you apart. We don't see people doing that very often, right? When they have the heart of Joseph, who looked at the evil done to him by others and said, God had his good purposes and meant this for good in my life. When we have the heart of Paul, who said, I will glory in my weaknesses because my weaknesses make me depend more on Christ, for his grace is sufficient for me. When we have the heart of Jesus, not my will, but your will be done. When we say, this world has nothing for me, therefore Christ is my portion and my strength, this sets us apart. Nobody in the world is living like that. And so when we're in the world and we're living in the world and people know what we're going through and they're seeing how we're handling it, people say, I didn't deal with it that way. That's different. I've never seen that. So my call to you today, drink from Christ, satisfy yourself in him and in his word. When you are thirsty, go back to him, drink some more. When there's nothing there, go back to him again. When you are physically hungry, what do? You eat. But what about days or times that you aren't hungry? You eat anyways because you know you need food to sustain you. You know you need nourishment, so you eat anyways. Folks, there's times like that in our lives, spiritually. Find your nourishment in Christ. The world is calling, the world is beckoning, the world is advertising and wanting you to try of her. But it is a cold, dark, ignorant, rotting, and dying world. Reject it for the cold, life-giving, everlasting nourishment of Christ. and then build your life upon it. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.